There's not going to be some new centralized system that's going to take the place of the state and corporations to save us. Like, we need to think about this where we're at. So the two things I think we can do collectively, simultaneously, is to...
Professor Dylan Rodriguez, activist, author, and a fearless community leader. This is RCNV Conversations.
Good morning, Dylan.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Honor. It's an honor.
All right, here's the question. As we approach the 2024 election, what key actions should individuals and communities prioritize to ensure their efforts against hate are sustainable and impactful?
I'm going to suggest that people collectively undertake two exercises simultaneously. And I emphasize collectively. I think one of the toxic things about the theater of especially presidential elections in the United States is that it reduces the realm of political power and of political struggle to a theater of individual performance and kind of staged conflict. So when we think about something like a presidential election, on the one hand, we need to understand it as theater. We need to understand it as a kind of staging of fairly modest and reconcilable disagreements between two hegemonic colonial political imperial political parties that don't fundamentally disagree on anything. Okay, fundamentally, they might have severe disagreements on particular policies, abortion. Right, abortion rights. Of course, there's going to be some profound disagreements around that, and that matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I'm saying in the broad realm of political struggle and political power, they agree on things like militarization. They agree on the constant role and mobilization of state power and even extra state power to rescue racial capitalism's detritus and violence and destruction and self-destruction from itself. So they agree on that, okay? The problem is that when we talk about things like the 2024 election, we are not encouraged to think about that scale of political mobilization or even of state power. We're encouraged to think about a contest of performances between really a couple individuals. And so the reason I emphasize the collective need to engage in the two exercises that I'm about to articulate is that if we do this collective, we are already pushing back against the contained, compartmentalized, caricatured version of politics, of political theater that we are constantly being pushed into. So we need to refuse that. Rethink hate, right? Rethink that word, that term, that concept, hate, and to rethink power. Okay. When I think about your question, those are the two keywords that come to mind that require some collective thinking. But when I say collective, it can be in an organizational setting, it can be at your dinner table, it can be in your office, whatever. It can be, if you're in a religious community of some kind, it doesn't matter. It could be your yoga studio. I think we need to come together. We need to have collective conversations that critically analyze the limitations in particular of the ways that we think about hate and the ways that we mobilize against hate, right? Precisely because the tendency is for the political, cultural, and emotional work around hate to once again collapse into the realm of individual or individualized conflict, right? And again, that then also becomes theatrical. So the danger of this is that by fixating on something like hate, we are encouraged to reduce forms of violence, of premature death, and of suffering, and of profound vulnerability, right? Targeted, uneven, asymmetrical vulnerability, meaning like there's specific people and bodies and communities and geographies that are targeted by violence. And it's not reducible to hate, right? These are systems and structures of violence. We are encouraged to reduce our analysis of those forms of violence and suffering and vulnerability to the realm of relatively individualized feelings.
Yeah.
Being hate. Okay, so there's that. We got to rethink that. We got to rethink the terms we use. And maybe some of the unintended consequences of the terms we use. Let me emphasize that, right? Like, I know that sometimes people will say hate as a catchphrase when what they're really talking about is systemic anti-Black violence, or they're talking about police power, or they're talking about, colonial racist occupation violence, right? So that's what they mean. But if they use the word hate, there's a tendency to translate that into the realm of individualized interactions and feelings. So we got to rethink hate. Now we're talking about the 2024 election in this question. That forces us, I think, it creates this kind of mandate for us to also rethink what political power actually is. Mm-hmm. That I would ask people to question the limitations of voting, of electoral politics, especially in a place like the United States, which is based on a winner-take-all apparatus, and at the level of a presidential election is based on the electoral college, right? I remain completely unconvinced. I've been unconvinced for most of, if not all, my adult life, that political power for people who are not at the top of the kind of food chain or the pyramid of these various bureaucratic institutions, whether it's the Democratic Party or Microsoft, right? Other than for people who are at the top of those institutional pyramids, I think for the overwhelming, massive majority of people in the United States, I think that they're culturally gaslit into believing that casting a ballot is somehow a form of political empowerment. I think almost entirely it is not, right? Now, the question is why? The question is, why is it that the masses of people, especially people who are subjected to these forms of structural and systemic vulnerability and targeting, right? I'm talking about poor people, unhoused people, all Black folks, right? Like all people who are or come from colonial conditions.
Migrants.
Yes, absolutely. Displaced people, migrant people, undocumented people, et cetera, right? Incarcerated people. We could keep going, So why is it that the peoples who are most targeted for systemic suffering, systemic misery, are encouraged to cast a ballot? We see, and we're inundated with it, right? On billboards, on social media, on TV, on the radio, everywhere, right? We're inundated with this notion that you are irresponsible if you don't think about political empowerment as participation in casting a ballot. So if we rethink that as a form of state propaganda and of corporate propaganda, it starts to make sense, okay? Because what the state and what corporate power fear the most and what they actively repress the most are the forms of empowerment and of political empowerment that vulnerable peoples and communities undertake on their own, right? When they create bases, kind of foundations and bases and infrastructures of collective empowerment that, first of all, resist the violence of the state. Because a lot of times the forms of empowerment that I'm talking about that are autonomously created by vulnerable communities are forms of self-protection. Right. I mean, there's so many people who have been thinking and writing about this that talk about how, for example, unhoused trans youth in San Francisco. My friend Eric Stanley at UC Berkeley has written a great book about this called Atmospheres of Violence. So what they write about in this book is how you have these communities of policed and targeted trans youth, unhoused trans youth, and the infrastructures of collective autonomous empowerment that they create are in many ways primarily a form of collective self-defense, right? Not just individual self, collective self-defense against the transphobic, anti-Black, colonial police power of the San Francisco Police Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what if we take examples like that as a modeling of other ways to understand power and political power in particular. Now what you've done is you've demystified the propaganda that you're inundated with that tells you that participation in this theater of the election is that is the goal, that's the point of what people call the civil rights movement. That's not true, right? The point of Black liberation struggle was to overthrow American apartheid, U.S. apartheid, right? The ballot was a modest reform component of this, right? And it was in many ways acknowledged as a symbolic reform, right? It was the ballot was never intended to be the primary expression of political empowerment. So I think those are the two things I would encourage as we approach the theater of the 2024 election, is to rethink those two terms, hate and power.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch how those supporting the liberation of Palestine sit on the fringes in this moment.
That's right. That's
and
right.
incredibly deflating and sad.
And are pushed to the fringes. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the levels of unprincipled cowardice that come from the very same elements within these institutions, not just the Democratic Party, not just the Republican Party, but yeah, I'm talking about universities, where places like where I work, right? People who will brand their institutions as through social justice lexicon,
Mhm.
right? Lexicons of equity and social justice, and all, of course, the DEI apparatus as well, who will at the very same time, um, call out the militarized police dogs on the most humble expressions of solidarity with Palestinian liberation, freedom, and life. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So that's why we got to rethink power.
So that's the measure, right?
Yes,
That's the measure. That's where
it
we are.
is.
So knowing
It
where we
is.
sit, knowing where we're sitting, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
I mean, in a way, it's so I'm sitting in this institution that has been involved in Palestinian liberation since the 1970s.
Hmm.
And I don't know that anybody anticipated that we'd be here in this moment witnessing the devastation and the pushback and the violence upon the Palestinian people this way. It's so incredibly unbelievable. And then the incredible pushback, even locally, when any of us dare to protest in any way, it's I can't even make sense of it sometimes. It's beyond my capacity to really absorb.
I've been thinking about this too. And I've been thinking about it alongside students and actually my kids, because my oldest is in college now, and he actually came to me with this question recently, because there was an encampment at his school, and he was kind of thoughtfully asking me for my own analysis of why some of the people he goes to school with react in a particular kind of um, dismissive and denigrating, you know, way toward students, faculty, staff, and community members that are involved in the encampment. So I've been thinking about what you're saying, about this reaction, right? What is it about the reaction? Like, why does there seem to be such a disproportionate, and often disproportionate reaction in terms of scales and levels and intensities of actual physical violence, against people who are making the most modest expressions, in my view, the most modest expressions of solidarity with peoples who, um, as the world has started calling it, right, peoples who are being subjected to a genocide, but a form of conquest, which Palestinian people themselves have been calling Nakba for going on 80 years, right? So like this thing's been ongoing. So what is it about that? And I think, as I was thinking through this with my son and with students and with others, I think part of what you are doing is that you are holding things to scrutiny, question, and destabilization that, a powerful, entitled colonial community takes for granted.
Mhm.
And I think what we learn in moments like that is that part of the primary political, cultural, and ideological work is to militantly disrupt, undermine, and fracture that which is taken for granted. And then we have to be collectively prepared to deal with and protect each other from the reaction and blowback that comes from that. And I'm talking just at the level of ideas, of words, of thought. Like the reaction against that is real, because why? And I tell my son this, is because people's worlds are being challenged. Like their worlds are actually being cracked, and they might even fall apart when they're forced to confront that which they take for granted.
There's an incredible amount of safety in those beliefs, an incredible
Yeah.
amount of safety and
And the thing, it's the most oppressive, violent form of safety, right? Because it's like what it requires is the subjection and domestication of all forms of struggle against, confinement, of occupation, of constant terror, of subjection to, instant evisceration by state power, and I'm talking legitimated state power, like legal state power. So that's what we're talking about, right? It's like how that's all legitimated. You challenge the legitimacy of those things, and people will actually freak out. Why? Because like their worlds fall apart. So they're right to react that way. That's the thing. They're actually right to react because those belief structures, the thing that you just called safety, that thing is so powerful that it is at the core, it is as much at the core of these oppressive colonial systems, like the occupation of Palestine, like the Nakba in Gaza and everywhere else. Okay, that is as central to those systems of occupation, dominance, and conquest as the actual tanks and soldiers are. Right. So that's what keeps it in place.
It's even more powerful because then it allows individuals, innocent, just regular folk, to just fall in line and have deep reactions. I mean, they're the web that keep it all together.
That's right.
I remember this, when I was volunteering with SCORE, it was a grassroots group that challenged racism essentially. And we had a teacher that would do the trainings with us. And she would often say, a white identified woman, she would often say that when she recognized that she had gone through her entire training as a teacher and nobody ever told her what she was actually walking into, and how she learned how she as a teacher was complicit in creating an atmosphere for Black and brown students that never allowed them to question their reality, that she couldn't. It blew her mind. It blew her mind that there was no space for her to actually have this learning, and that it made her sick to her stomach the moment she put it together in her own head. It made her sick to her stomach that she had just fallen into this so casually. And so it was, it took her own revolution, right, of putting these things together, being a witness to it, and then pushing back, and then stepping out and wanting to come back and do something about it. But I just want to say that because it happens in these little tiny incremental ways that you don't even notice it.
And this is the thing. This is the thing about the way you just put it too, is that the logic of how these systems work in creating a climate of ideological, what I would call it a form of ideological pacification, right? In the sense that, and I'm saying pacification as like a kind of an active process, that's the kind of institutionalized ideology that I'm talking about. It creates a kind of constant wave of trying to pacify people who otherwise might not be willing to accept that which is taken for granted, including things like the K through 12 public school education system and its bureaucratic administrative apparatus, right? And its curriculum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is how the ideological structures work, is that they also work to pacify people at the scale of the individual. So one of the things that I've learned, actually I learned very quickly at my job, is that university administrators, one of the things that they fear and despise the most are unions, right? And you would, I mean, I remember it struck me the first time I encountered, this is when I was still a graduate student, and I was thinking, I hadn't started thinking of the university as a corporation in a real sense yet. I understood it kind of metaphorically and politically as a corporation, but I didn't understand its materiality and its administrative and political responsiveness as that of a corporation yet. But I quickly did once I understood how they were responding to the presence and the existence of unions. And that's because what unions, by their very existence, do is they de-individualize the working conditions, right? And I would say the other thing that university administrations fear, and they don't necessarily despise them, they want to solicit and accommodate them, are student movements, organized student movements. Because then what happens is that students no longer think about themselves as individual, socially mobile units of the society, right? Which is exactly what the public relations apparatus of places like UC Riverside want to promote, right? They want to talk about social mobility, which is very much about an individualized Horatio Alger type upward mobility story, right? It's about individualized success. So what these places also don't want to deal with is a kind of a transformation or really an overthrow of the attachment to individualized stories and narratives of progress, um, uh, in favor of notions of collective mobilizations for transformation, for disruption of the oppressive business as usual, and for justice, right? However, and of course, we're constantly debating what justice means, and so like that is not what these institutions want to encourage. And so that's the other dimension of this, is that the way that we end up challenging these apparatuses, like I think we have to constantly strive to be in some form of collective setting when we do that, so that we don't remain isolated and we don't get again subjected to these structures and forces of pacification, which are very isolating.
Yep, I agree. Let's go to question 2. How does your critical approach to studying resistance inform your understanding of effective strategies to combat systemic hate? And could you share an example where this perspective has been particularly insightful? I think you might have answered this already, but
could you say it one more time? Could you repeat it one more time, the question?
How does your critical approach to studying resistance inform your understanding of effective strategies to combat systemic hate? And could you share an example?
So the question's brilliant. So let me just highlight some parts of that question that I want to honor in a deep way. First is this first part of the question is about the critical approach to study. So I want to say that I think at its best, critical approaches to study are also undertaken in some form of collective. Okay, so like I'm no genius, I'm no individual. Like everything that I do, think, teach, and write has in some way emerged out of a collective setting, even if it's archival, right? Even if I'm just learning from a community of writers and thinkers who have shaped my kind of analysis and therefore my approach to strategic thinking as well. Okay, so like that's all collective. That's not coming from anyone individually. So I think the notion of a critical collective approach to study is key here. I think if you're able to cultivate that, if you're able to cultivate communities, collectives of critical study, you've accomplished a lot. You have created a foundation for robust and dynamic strategic thinking, and for that matter, tactical thinking. And I will say, as I think maybe a kind of portable, malleable critique of what's been happening in recent times, one of the things that I've heard the most from encampment organizers through especially the spring months of 2024 was that in places where there was a relative absence of collective study and collective critical study in particular, the strategic thinking and the tactical thinking around the encampments was deeply compromised, right? Most importantly, it was frequently made vulnerable to the solicitations and the compromises that were offered by the administration, right? That by the time organizers and especially students, I mean, even to some extent faculty, were trying to understand the context, it was sort of too late. Like people had made agreements to things, the implications of which they didn't fully analyze or understand until afterward, right? And then it was like, oh, damn, now we just agreed to participate in some task force that we know is actually just a way to pacify and demobilize our movement. So that's fine. It's fine to survive that moment as long as you can take a lesson from it. The lesson is that you have to convene critical collective study in dynamic contexts, including in places like encampments, right? So, okay, so there's that. The second part of your question is around how critical approaches to study might inform the kind of strategic approaches to systemic hate. Well, one of the things it does is it disarticulates the notion of hate being the primary logic that animates these systems. right? And I think that that is a really critical analytical distinction that we need to make. And I'll say one reason why. Um, it's because if we think about hate as the primary or one of the primary logics that animates these oppressive systems, then the problem becomes that um, we can easily be funneled into therapeutic programs or therapeutic strategies that attempt to address the hate, right? When you're addressing the hate, you're actually dealing with your oppressor and or accomplices with your oppressor, right? And you are trying to deal with their feelings, right? You're trying to deal with their maybe misled or what you view as their uneducated or undereducated belief systems and ideological attachments rather than the casualties.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you can have casualties to a systemic violence that is actually divested of the hate. And I will say this, I would argue that the soulless, unfeeling, dead-eyed bureaucrat is at least as dangerous as the on-fire right-wing, hateful acting reactionary. Right? And I'm talking about in terms of the roles that they play in creating casualties among the peoples who are targeted in these uneven, asymmetrical ways by these systemic structures. Right? Anti-blackness, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-migrant hatred. I mean, we're seeing it right now, right? We're seeing it right. Like this thing about that Trump marched out, right? And that JD Vance are marching out around Haitian migrants in Ohio, et cetera, right? Like that's just again the theatrical tip of the iceberg. What we're talking about is a system that is created a systemic animus, right? So it's not even hate, it's just a systemic violence that is targeting that particular community of people, of displaced and migrant people, so that they then become vulnerable to that theater. So there's all this stuff that precedes the hate,
So
right?
we're
So if
seeing
you're,
it, so we're
yeah,
seeing it play out as an act of propaganda
absolutely.
and
No, no, that's
an act of desperation.
yeah. And the
Because he
problem,
knows, fundamentally, they know that there
yeah,
are a lot of people out there that are asking for that sort of political pushback, right?
yeah. And the problem that a lot of folks that identify with the side of social justice, et cetera, have is that our response is to what we perceive to be the hatefulness, like the strident racist performativity of this stuff, right? Well, our response is to that, which is okay as an immediate casualty management measure, right? You do have to respond to that, but I'm saying that is not an adequate response. So if we're talking about systemic violence, we're not talking merely about hate. In fact, hate becomes a relatively minor part of that equation. If you're talking about systemic violence in a deep way, you are now holding your collective selves responsible for developing strategies that will address far more than the individualized animus of individual people. Right now, you're actually having to deal with the activities that are done on a mundane, everyday basis by those dead-eyed, soulless people who have no feelings of hate. Right? All they feel is a commitment to the bureaucratic apparatus. Right? And that's what we're
Or
talking about. Like,
a commitment to country,
yes,
right?
yes,
A loyalty
absolutely.
to country. Yeah.
Yep. And they do it out of what they would say is love.
For country.
Right? Yeah. They would say they do it out of patriotic love, right? Which others, oh, it's now, so, but again, it's like, that part actually, that's the performative theatrical part of it. The fact of the matter is what we're trying to deal with strategically and analytically are the casualties. And we're trying to get to are the things that extract those casualties. If we're doing that, then we're talking about violence. We're not just talking about hate or patriotism for that matter.
Yeah. I love it. Third question. And I think we're going to end it here. Let's see what time it is. 9:43. All right. Redefining community safety and resistance. In your Harvard Law Review article, you argue for an abolitionist praxis of human being as a method of fundamentally reconceiving community safety. How can communities adopt this approach to more effectively address and prevent hate crimes and systemic violence? What are the practical steps that individuals and communities can take to move away from punitive systems to more holistic, inclusive forms of justice?
This is the question for, I think, communities of anti-violence practitioners, people who identify as abolitionists, even kind of progressive liberal types who are concerned with various forms of interpersonal violence and state violence, especially from the police, from Homeland Security, et cetera, et cetera. This is the question: is how can communities, and I'm going to use the word autonomous, how can communities create autonomous, self-trained and self-sustaining forms of protection and defense and collective safety that don't require permission or participation from state institutions? That's the question, right? That's the question. So I think in a sense the answers are everywhere, right? So I'm going to say that I think in a sense the answers are everywhere. We see this, for example, I'll talk about a particular community of people that I'm thinking about right now, which is organizing around the waves of vulnerability and exposure that have been created by the federal and state government's repression of militant pro-Palestine activism, in particular one activist who has been subjected to federal charges, right? So the way that this community of people has organized around both the person that is being prosecuted by the state, that person's family, and then the communities to which they are connected is complex, it's layered, and it's dynamic, and it utilizes every possible tactic. So it utilizes the legal apparatus, meaning that you have experts, including attorneys, involved in that form of defense. So I'm saying that becomes part of the answer to your question. You have to utilize multiple fronts and multiple skill sets. You have movement lawyers. We call them movement lawyers involved with this. You have people who have access to institutions like universities and who have skill sets that come from studying a lot, right? You bring them into the picture and say, okay, let's build a collective analysis. What's going on here institutionally? What are the strategic structures? What are the strategic practices that we can undertake? What are the creative historical examples that we can draw from? So people bring in that skill set. Grassroots organizers, again, especially grassroots organizers who are already trying and already have been doing and are still trying to do various forms of autonomous activity that self-sustain, including economics, including internal economic self-sufficiency, and self-defense, collective community self-defense. They have skill sets and practices, and especially networks of people who will actually mobilize to do that work of being present. So the short and long answer to your question is about presence, right? And I'm saying like being present for each other, being present for each other. Abolitionists have been saying a version of this for a long time, right? Which is that Ruthie Gilmore famously says that abolition is about presence, right? I would say abolition is also about destruction and absence, right? That you are actually trying to destroy oppressive relations and institutions, right? You're also trying to evacuate the existence of particular systems and organizations and apparatuses that are oppressive, right? So it is very much about destruction and absence, but the form of presence I want to emphasize is people's presence for each other. And it sounds so simple, and yet it is such a severe challenge in an advanced, crumbling, neoliberal, anti-Black colonial world, especially a place like the United States, which has organized every institutional logic to mitigate and undermine community, right? And in the form of collective presence that I'm talking about. So where are the places you find that kind of presence best exemplified? I would point to places like mobilizations against acute practices of oppressive state power. So when you were watching the community form in and around Atlanta, resisting Cop City, right? Resisting the construction of Cop City. I think for decades to come, people who are serious will be looking to the example of Stop Cop City for lessons in how to create and sustain precisely the forms of community safety that you're talking about, right? And I think in that sense, it did not fail. Right. So I want to stay away from the language of success and failure. So yeah, sometimes the state will do the stuff it's going to do. OK. And they will create casualties in doing so. I don't think Stop Cop City was a failure just because they pushed. And I think it actually was in many ways exemplary, because the amount of friction and disruption that created for a state process, which others would have taken for granted, is exemplary. And the forms of community safety the forms of interpersonal care and presence that were created in the process of Stop Cop City mobilizations are profound, right? So that's one particular example, but we can go all the way down the line of other smaller to larger scale examples that exemplify this. So I would say, in terms of thinking about community safety and how to adopt it, this is the best way to do it, including what, a lot of folks have talked about in various communities, including the Asian and Asian American community, around so-called hate crimes, right? Well, there's a couple problems with the way folks have been approaching this. One thing is that for the most part, that terminology does not take into account the fact that the way that the state defines a hate crime is so profoundly narrow that a lot of the things that people want to attribute as hate crimes are actually not. Right. So then what do you call it? Well, you can call it other kinds of things that probably have a more robust implication for what you're doing. Like, for example, racist, misogynist, anti-sex worker violence, if you want to talk about the so-called Atlanta spa shootings.
Yeah. And so much of the classification of a hate crime is, I mean, it relies on the DA making a call to actually
and they almost never do it.
Mm-mm.
Right? Because they'll say that there's a burden of proof, and that's again, that is systemic. Okay. So if we're actually now if we drop that terminology, if we're no longer limiting ourselves to talking about hate crimes, like let's take a hiatus from that. Let's take a hiatus from constantly resorting to the language of hate crimes to talk about forms of gendered, racist, anti-Black, and colonial violence. Let's change our language for a minute. Let's change. Why? Because it then changes our analysis, it changes our strategy, it changes our collective approach. If we can do that, then I think we can get much more serious at the level of trying to build forms of collectivity and ideally forms of community that actually take responsibility for presence. Presence is what prevents and mitigates and manages the casualties of those forms of violence. That's what does it. And every colonized, enslaved community in the history of the modern archive has exemplified that. Right? That's how people survive those conditions of repression and oppression. And it's also how they rebel and foster liberation struggle against them. It's precisely because of those forms of presence that are about creating collective forms of safety and collective forms of empowerment that have nothing to do with a damn election.
Yeah, and in very practical ways, just in my own experience of doing activism in my own community, there's, by the time you're in political office, you're essentially shackled to the norms of that system and that culture. And oftentimes, the objection to anything that is being challenged can't come from within, like literally can't come from inside.
Yeah. There's no such thing. You have no agency.
Well, you have no agency as an individual coming in, right?
Yes.
Because you work for the system, you work for the people at large. So you're really relying on somebody coming in from the outside to introduce the thing that's needed in order for it to catch any wind or have any notice. So you have to show up to these spaces and challenge the things that we want, to push back on in your body with your voice and the people that are supporting you. The system is set up that way. So absolutely we have to show up.
And I can't agree more with what you're saying, because what it comes down to is that the state and the nonprofit apparatus are not coming to save most of the folks who most are in need of just basic things like food, like water, like protection from violence, right? Those things are not coming to.
We saw it with the pandemic.
We see it right now with the wildfires all across the state of California. First of all, this like people who work for the state unintentionally start the wildfires. Why? It's not because they're incompetent, because this is the way the state apparatus works. Because they extract labor from people, right? They put them in conditions that are untenable for just basic heavy labor, and then put them in machines. I mean, the fire that just started next to my house was likely caused by sparks from a state-owned heavy machine that was moving boulders to try to protect what? Rich people's private property from having people on ATVs and motorcycles ride on them. So and this was being done during the hottest part of September, right? In under conditions that were ideal to start a wildfire. And the state told these laborers, these workers, to go out and do that. So this is what we're talking about. The state is not only is the state not going to say, the state is going to endanger you. The state is actually going to bring the fire to you. Okay. So we're in a position, I think, in this moment, it's not somewhere far off, in this moment, where basic things like safety from fire, even fire prevention, access to potable water, energy and power, meaning like folks are going to have to start to figure out how to not rely on the state and on, kind of privatized energy and corporations to access things like power. We're in a position where we have to start thinking about these questions that you're raising in a deeply organic and collective way where we are at. Because there's not going to be some new centralized system that's going to take the place of the state and corporations to save us. Like, we need to think about this where we are at, and we start to develop, we start asking these questions and bring an answer to these questions all the time, right? Both to prevent the forms of systemic violence, attack, and vulnerability that we've been talking about, but also just to meet collective needs. We're in that position at this point.
A whole different kind of democracy.
Yeah. A democracy does not rely on a centralized bureaucracy, but rather relies on a collective practice. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. And that's what a just world would feel like. It's not this kind of grandiose thing where there's some new centralized party apparatus that has suddenly redeemed the Democrats from themselves. That's not what this is going to look like. Like, we're looking, and again, we have examples all around us. We just need to take them seriously and learn from them as models rather than as exceptions.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation. Learned so much from you today.
Learn from you. We could go on for 3 hours.
I really appreciate your work, the work that you're doing at your university, how you support your students, and the fact that you showed up for us today.
All day, every day. All day, every day. You call on me anytime.